Today I'm out in a small studio in Thermal, California, taking a look at the all-new Subaru WRX for 2022. What does Subaru mean by all new? Well, pretty much everything is brand new. We have a new engine, new suspension designs with available active dampers for the very first time in a WRX. We have a completely new interior, more active safety systems than we had before, and most importantly, an all-new engine as well. This is now a 2.4-liter boxer, giving this better performance than the WRX has had in the past. Now, I haven't been able to drive the new WRX just yet, but be sure and stay tuned because I will be driven around a track in this vehicle, the manual transmission model and the new automatic transmission as well. The front end design is definitely modern Subaru. We have the distinctive front end grille right there with a Subaru logo. LED headlights are standard, as is a lot of black cladding. The black cladding has been a bit controversial, so let me know what you think about it down there in the comment section. Personally, I don't mind the black cladding at all, and perhaps my stance on the black cladding is the most controversial of all. No WRX would be complete without a big hood scoop, so of course we find one up here. No comment yet from Subaru about an upcoming WRX STI, but if I were a betting man, I would say you should see details about that coming in a few months. You'll notice that Subaru is no longer calling this the Impreza WRX, and that's because the relationship between the Impreza and the WRX have become more distant as every generation has gone on. At this point in time, very little of the structure of this vehicle borrows directly from the Impreza. Obviously, some design elements are similar, and we have a very similar roofline, and they said perhaps the A pillar, maybe the B pillar is shared, but this is wider than the Impreza. It has a different hood, it has different sheet metal all the way around on this level of the vehicle, different hood, different interior, etc. Even the seats are different, the dashboard is different as well. And that's largely because the WRX is wider than the Impreza. This is still technically a compact performance sedan, so you can compare this to something like the upcoming Honda Civic Type R if and when we ever see that model. But because they wanted to be able to fit 245 with tires on this vehicle and a slightly wider track, the body had to get wider. So instead of tacking fender flares onto an Impreza, they decided to redesign the entire body itself. The tail lamps have a really cool design inside. They're a reflector design with what looks sort of like broken glass as the texture inside. It really gives an interesting touch. It reminds me a lot of certain modern Mercedes models. We have a small lip spoiler right here on top of the trunk lid. You can expect a bigger one in upcoming performance models. Quad exhaust tips down here at the bottom, and again, more of that black cladding right there below the trunk lid. Speaking of the trunk lid, this is still a sedan, so it still has a traditional trunk. It's not a hatchback or a liftback. Tires on this model are still 245 width. This particular model has Dunlop tires on it. Wide tires are definitely one of the reasons that they needed to flare the body out versus the regular Impreza. A little bit more of that cladding going on right here around the wheel wells. And on the front wheel wells, we have functional vents. Those help relieve pressure up front, so you can see right through that vent right there. Be sure and let me know what you think about these big wheel well claddings. Again, they don't bother me at all, but I know that some people have found them to be a little bit controversial. One of the big changes for the new WRX happens under the hood, where we find a new 2.4-liter turbocharged engine. This is loosely based around the 2.4-liter turbo from the Subaru Ascent, but it's been modified for duty in the WRX. Subaru at this point would like me to remind you that this is a very early prototype vehicle. That's why we're not allowed to drive them yet, because not everything on this car is exactly as it will be for the final production model. Power goes up to 271 horsepower. Torque remains about the same as the outgoing engine at 258 pound-feet, but the torque curve is much broader. And thanks to a new wastegate design on the turbo, boost is improved as well as turbo lag. We don't have any fuel economy estimates just yet, but as you'd expect in a WRX, this is going to be available with a 6-speed manual or the new Subaru Performance transmission, which is essentially a reworked version of the CVT that we found in the previous WRX. I haven't been able to test it just yet, but they claim that shift times are drastically improved, and it should be a pretty direct competitor to some of those other automatic transmissions that you might find in performance competitors that cost an awful lot more than the WRX. That costing more thing is probably important to keep in mind. Although I don't know how much the new WRX is going to cost, you can expect it to not depart too far from where we see the existing WRX. And that means that this is likely going to be significantly less expensive than something like a Mercedes-Benz CLA with about 300 horsepower and all-wheel drive. Outside of something along those lines, or a BMW 2 Series, you aren't really going to find anything that is about this size with this kind of power and with all-wheel drive. You won't find it in the Volkswagen Jetta, you won't find it in the Elantra N or the Civic Si, or even the upcoming Civic Type R. Now let's hop inside for a quick look. The first thing you're likely to notice inside is the new nearly 12-inch touchscreen infotainment system. This has basically been borrowed out of the Subaru Outback and the Subaru Legacy. It's well integrated into the dashboard. It offers CarPlay integration and Android Auto integration. There's some physical buttons here for some of the climate control functions. The rest of them are controlled via that touchscreen. The rest of the dashboard is definitely different than we find in the Subaru Impreza. It actually borrows a little bit from the Impreza in terms of design and a little bit from the Outback, the Ascent, really all the other Subaru models. The door panels look very similar similar to other Subaru vehicles like the Impreza, but because of the added width of the vehicle and the fact that the doors themselves are still pretty slim, I suspect that interior room is actually going to be a little bit better than the current generation Impreza. We have a bottle holder right down there at the bottom of the door. Recaro seats are standard on all models. This one has the WRX logo right there on the headrest. If you get the very top-end version, the GT version, which is new for 2022, then the interior fittings get a little bit nicer. Right here in the center, we have a 6-speed manual, again, absolutely essential in a WRX. About 3/4 of all WRX models or so should have the manual transmission. Handbrake right there, 2 decently sized cup holders, and a teeny tiny center armrest. On the driver's side, we have a small color LCD in the middle between those 2 large analog gauges, a 3-spoke steering wheel with a flat bottom, and if you get the performance transmission, which is the automatic, that's Subaru speak for automatic now, we then get paddle shifters on the back of the steering wheel. To the left of the steering wheel, you can see that the driver's side is styled very much like the passenger side with that new air vent design there, which I do find pretty sleek. Some really interesting texturing going on there on the door panels. And again, what certainly feels like a bit more room. If I'm sitting very comfortably in this seat, I have a decent amount of distance between my leg and the front door. In the rear, we see some similar changes to the back. One thing that surprised me, no air vents right there between the front seats. The rear seat design is also different than the one that we find in the Impreza. And then right back there on the rear deck lid, we find an enormous subwoofer because this is available with the Harman Kardon audio system. The rear seats still have a 60/40 folding design, and it looks like a pretty decent amount of trunk space as well. 2022 brings a new trim level for the WRX. It's the new GT trim, and you can think of this as the luxury WRX trim. I really like the different seat design. These are still Recaro seats, but these are a more luxurious, more comfortable seat design. It has suede-like fabric on the inside. This appears to be Alcantara. I don't know if it's actually branded Alcantara or not, but it's a 2-tone seat. So we have a dark charcoal section, light charcoal section right there, dark charcoal wrap right there around the outside, red contrasting stitching, still very, very aggressive bolsters, but I found this seat design to be really quite comfortable. The design of the door panels remains the same, but we get that contrasting red stitching and the same sort of Alcantara inserts right there on the dashboard and on the doors. Lots of soft touch materials, which is a nice touch. That same nearly 12-inch infotainment screen right there, basically the same infotainment system and instrument cluster. Steering wheel design remains the same with that flat bottom right there, and then to the left of the driver, we have a lot of soft touch materials again, which really dresses up the entire cabin. One thing that I didn't expect to see in the new WRX is the next generation of Subaru's EyeSight system. This uses a slimmed down module for the dual camera setup. You'll only find this in the automatic transmission WRXs, however. This gives you features like adaptive cruise control, autonomous braking, etc. You won't find all those same active safety features in the manual transmission model because for some reason the software for this EyeSight system isn't compatible. We have a pretty standard sized moonroof right there over the driver and front passengers' heads. One big change between the automatic and manual transmission vehicles are the buttons right down here. We can press this button and then get our individual drive mode program over here on this screen. You can see we have Comfort, Normal, Sport, Sport Plus, and Individual. Lots of different things you can configure. You can configure the power unit, regular, sharp, sharp plus, the steering. That affects the steering assist, not the steering ratio. We have an adaptive suspension system in this model, so you can adjust those 3 different levels there. All-wheel drive system, normal and sport. Sport will try and send a little bit more power to the rear. The manual transmission can send 50% of power to the rear. The automatic can send 55%. You can also select the way the EyeSight system is going to respond. That's important if you're out on a track. You're probably going to want dynamic, and you can choose whether you want the climate control to be mild or normal to keep the cabin a little bit more comfortable even when you're on a really hot track. And right now at this point in time it is 99 degrees, but out on the actual track today it has been 109. The start button selects the individual drive mode. The mode button cycles through those various drive modes, so you don't have to press a button and then tap the screen. My bad, sometimes I get things wrong, and this is one of them. The large, nearly 12-inch screen is not in fact standard. Instead, what is standard is this 2-screen infotainment setup, very similar to what we see in the Outback and the Subaru Legacy. The upper screen gives you your typical infotainment features like Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, media, etc. And the lower screen right down here is used for features like climate control, vehicle settings, driving assistance settings, etc. The 2 screens together operate very much like that larger infotainment screen, but this is actually the one that you'll find on base models. Screen real estate is not really that much different between this system and the larger system. Really just that band right there in the middle is missing where we find the physical buttons, and then of course we have single zone automatic climate control with the button over there on the passenger side. In case you're wondering, push button start is not standard, it's optional. This particular model does not have the push button start option. Out on the track, the WRX is clearly a ton of fun. Now obviously I have not been able to drive this model or test any numbers just yet, but you should logically expect 0 to 60 to happen a little bit faster than before. The big reason for that is the different engine and a different final drive ratio. It's definitely more aggressive than before. They've borrowed the 4.44 to 1 axle ratio out of the Subaru Ascent, stuffed it into the WRX. That gives us a much more aggressive starting ratio, whether we're talking about the manual transmission or the new automatic transmission. Horsepower is a little bit up from last year. Torque seems to be about the same on the spec sheet, but Subaru was really clear that the torque curve is quite different. So torque happens a little bit earlier. Now on the spec sheet, the peak happens from the same range approximately as the previous engine, but before that 2000 RPM or so point, you're going to get more torque out of the 2.4 liter engine, and it's going to build more rapidly with less lag. And after the peak torque happens in this engine, you're going to get more torque after that point than you had in the previous engine. It's also worth noting that if you plan on modifying your WRX, this larger displacement engine is probably going to be a little bit better at that, thanks to the larger displacement. So if you're the kind of person that takes your WRX, replaces the turbocharger, changes the software, etc., this is probably going to be more amenable to those changes and give you even more power if that's something that you're after. 60 to 0 stopping distances are largely going to be affected by the vehicle's curb weight, and that is unfortunately one thing that I do not know yet about the new WRX. Subaru has mentioned a lot of weight savings in certain areas, but they were not specific as to whether the entire vehicle itself is lighter or heavier than the current generation. I expect it's probably not going to be too far apart, but thanks to some of the added equipment, it may be a little bit on the heavier side rather than on the lighter side of things. Now, if you choose the automatic transmission version, it is still a CVT at heart, but it's imitating 8-stepped ratios. Now, why did Subaru choose this direction rather than a traditional automatic? A lot of this really simply has to do with the cost. Subaru already has a CVT that fits in this platform vehicle that mates with this engine. They would have to completely reinvent the wheel in order to get an automatic transmission that would fit with the all-wheel drive system that Subarus are known for. Remember that the front differential is integrated into the transmission case. So outside of a vehicle like an Audi A4 or an Audi A6, you don't really have any transmissions readily available off the shelf that would simply bolt into a WRX and function the way the WRX's transmission does. And that's the reason that we still have a CVT here. They've certainly cleaned things up. The shifts do feel a little bit crisper from the passenger seat, but it's a little bit hard to tell exactly what this will be like behind the driver's seat. You should know that fuel economy is probably going to be the best with the continuously variable automatic transmission, and I don't suspect that too many people out there will notice too much of a difference. Subaru has done a decent job at imitating those transmission shifts. The manual transmission is relatively unchanged from before. Power split is 50-50 front to rear. It is not adjustable. If you get the automatic transmission, theoretically a bit more can be sent to the rear, 55% to that rear axle, but this is never going to feel like a Ford Mustang on the track. It's never going to get tail happy. Instead, Subaru's mission was to make this a very reliable, very planted vehicle with a little bit of understeer that's definitely very predictable. Hopefully at some point in the future, the adaptive suspension will be available with the manual transmission. Subaru said that this is not a technical limitation, they simply chose not to package it with the manual transmission at this time. And there you have it. That's a very brief look at the new 2022 Subaru WRX. Again, I don't know how fast this goes 0 to 60, how much it's going to cost, or exactly when you'll be able to get your hands on it. But if you want one, now's the time to contact your Subaru dealer and get on a list, because I'm sure there's probably going to be a waiting list, at least at the very beginning, for the new WRX. In the meantime, be sure and hit that subscribe button down there. Find me over at social media, all those other social places, because I will be driving this just as soon as I possibly can. I'll see all of you later.